7 Sacred Tales for Inner Harmony. In the quiet spaces between our thoughts and the gentle pauses between our breaths, ancient wisdom waits to guide us home to ourselves. These 7 sacred tales have been passed down through generations of seekers, each one a key that unlocks a different door to inner harmony and deeper understanding. In our modern world of endless notifications and constant demands, these stories offer us something precious, a chance to remember what it feels like to be truly at peace. They invite us to step away from the noise and reconnect with the timeless truths that have sustained human hearts through every age and circumstance. So find a comfortable place to rest, allow your shoulders to soften, and let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of these gentle teachings. Open yourself to receive these gifts of wisdom that have brought comfort and clarity to countless souls before you. Part 1. Finding Center in Chaos. Story 1. The Potter's Wheel. In a small village known for its beautiful ceramics, there lived a master potter whose work was prized throughout the region. His pottery was not only functional, but possessed an almost mystical beauty that seemed to radiate peace and harmony. Students came from distant places to learn his techniques, but they often left frustrated because the master's methods seemed impossibly simple. One day, during a hectic market season, a young apprentice was struggling at his wheel. The clay kept collapsing, his hands were shaking with nervousness, and the noise of the crowded marketplace outside was making it impossible for him to concentrate. Every time a cart clattered by or someone shouted, his pottery would wobble and fall apart. "Master," the apprentice called out in frustration, "how can I possibly create anything beautiful with all this chaos around us? The noise is unbearable, and I can't find any peace to focus on my work." The master potter looked up from his wheel, where a perfect vase was taking shape despite the commotion outside. His hands moved with fluid grace, and his expression remained serene, even as a particularly loud argument erupted just outside their workshop. "Come here," the master said gently, "and place your hands on my wheel while I work." The apprentice approached hesitantly and placed his hands alongside his teacher's on the spinning clay. Immediately, he noticed something remarkable. At the very center of the wheel, there was a point of complete stillness. No matter how fast the wheel spun or how much clay moved around it, this central point remained perfectly motionless. "Do you feel that?" the master asked. "That place of absolute quiet in the center?" The apprentice nodded, amazed. "That center exists within you as well," the master explained, his hands never pausing in their work. "The world around us will always be spinning. There will always be noise, demands, and distractions. But you have a choice. You can be thrown around by the spinning, or you can find your center and create from that place of stillness." He continued, "When I work, I don't try to stop the noise outside. Instead, I connect with the quiet center within myself. From that place, I can shape the clay with love and intention, regardless of what chaos surrounds me." The apprentice returned to his wheel with this new understanding. Instead of fighting against the external noise, he focused on finding that inner center of calm. To his amazement, as he connected with this quiet space within himself, his hands grew steady, and his pottery began to take beautiful form, even as the marketplace continued its bustling activity around them. The lesson. The potter's wheel teaches us that inner peace is not dependent on external circumstances being perfect. Like the still center of the spinning wheel, we each have an unshakable place of calm within us that exists regardless of how chaotic our outer world becomes. When we learn to work from this centered place, we can create beauty and respond wisely, even amid turbulence. This story reminds us that we don't need to control our environment to find peace. We need to discover and rest in the peaceful center that already exists within us. Story 2. The Lighthouse Keeper's Wisdom. On a rocky coast where fierce storms regularly battered the shoreline, there stood an ancient lighthouse that had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century. The lighthouse keeper was an old man who had tended the beacon for 30 years, never missing a single night of keeping the light burning bright, no matter how severe the weather became. One autumn evening, a young sailor whose ship had been damaged in a storm sought shelter at the lighthouse. As the wind howled and waves crashed against the rocks with tremendous force, the sailor became increasingly anxious watching the lighthouse sway and creak under the assault of the storm. "Aren't you afraid?" the sailor asked the keeper as another powerful gust shook the entire structure. "This lighthouse seems so fragile against such a massive storm. What if it collapses? What if the light goes out and ships are lost?" The old keeper smiled calmly as he continued his evening routine of tending the beacon, checking the oil, and cleaning the lens. "This lighthouse has weathered hundreds of storms, far worse than this one," he replied. "Would you like to know the secret of how it has survived so long?" The curious sailor nodded eagerly. "Come with me to the very top," the keeper said, leading the way up the spiral staircase. As they climbed higher, the sailor noticed that the swaying motion of the lighthouse became more pronounced. His fear increased with each step. When they reached the lamproom at the very top, the keeper pointed to the massive beacon. "This light has 3 essential qualities that allow it to fulfill its purpose, no matter what storms may come. First, it is firmly anchored. Its foundation goes deep into the bedrock below. Second, it is designed to bend and sway rather than resist rigidly. This flexibility keeps it from breaking. And third, it never wavers in its primary purpose of shining light into the darkness." As if to demonstrate his point, a tremendous gust of wind struck the lighthouse, causing it to sway noticeably. But the light continued to burn steadily, casting its beam far out to sea where ships in distress could see it. "You see," the keeper continued, "the lighthouse doesn't fight the storm, it dances with it. It moves with the wind rather than against it, but its light never falters. In the same way, we can learn to bend with life's storms while keeping our inner light burning bright." The sailor spent the night watching the keeper tend the beacon, and gradually he began to understand. The old man's calm presence wasn't due to the absence of danger, but to his deep trust in his foundation and his unwavering commitment to his purpose. By morning, when the storm had passed, the sailor felt he had learned something more valuable than navigation. He had learned how to be a lighthouse in his own life. The lesson: the lighthouse keeper's wisdom teaches us about finding stability through flexibility and purpose. Like the lighthouse that survives by bending with the storm while maintaining its essential function, we can learn to adapt to life's challenges without losing sight of our core values and purpose. The story shows us that true strength comes not from rigid resistance to change, but from having deep roots in our principles combined with the flexibility to respond gracefully to whatever circumstances arise. When we know who we are and why we're here, we can weather any storm while continuing to shine our light for others who may be struggling in the darkness. Story 3. The Mirror Lake. High in the mountains, hidden among ancient pines and granite peaks, lay a perfectly still lake that was renowned for the clarity of its reflections. The water was so pure and undisturbed that it acted like a flawless mirror, showing the sky, clouds, and mountains with such precision that visitors often couldn't tell where reality ended and reflection began. A young scholar who had spent years studying philosophy and spiritual texts heard about this miraculous lake and decided to make the difficult journey to see it for himself. He believed that viewing this natural wonder might provide him with the profound insight he had been seeking through all his reading and contemplation. When he finally reached the lake after days of challenging hiking, he was initially disappointed. The water looked ordinary to him, just a simple mountain lake surrounded by trees and rocks. He couldn't understand what was supposed to be so special about it. Frustrated, he began throwing stones into the water, watching the ripples spread across the surface. "This is just a regular lake," he muttered. "I've wasted my time coming here. There's nothing miraculous about it at all." An old woman who lived in a small cabin nearby heard the commotion and came to see what was happening. She found the young man continuing to throw rocks, creating more and more disturbance on the water's surface. "Excuse me," she said gently. "May I ask what you're looking for?" "I came here to see the famous Mirror Lake," he replied irritably, "but it's obviously just a myth. This water shows nothing but chaos and confusion." The old woman smiled and sat down on a nearby rock. "Please, come sit with me and stop throwing stones for a moment," she invited. Reluctantly, the scholar joined her and ceased his rock throwing. As they sat in silence, the ripples on the lake's surface gradually began to settle. Slowly, the water became more and more still, until finally it achieved perfect calm. In that moment of complete stillness, the young man gasped in wonder. The lake had indeed become a perfect mirror, reflecting the mountains, sky, and clouds with such breathtaking clarity that it seemed like he was looking through a window into another world. "Now you see," the old woman said softly, "the lake was always a perfect mirror. The problem was not with the lake, but with the disturbance you were creating. When you stopped throwing stones and allowed the water to become still, its true nature was revealed." She continued, "Your mind is like this lake. When it's constantly agitated by thoughts, worries, judgments, and distractions, you cannot see clearly. But when you learn to be still, your mind becomes a perfect mirror that reflects truth with absolute clarity." The scholar understood. He had been so busy throwing the stones of intellectual analysis and restless seeking that he had never allowed his mind to become quiet enough to see what was already there. The lesson: the mirror lake teaches us that clarity of understanding comes not from adding more knowledge or experiences, but from learning to be still enough to see what is already present. Like the lake that could only show perfect reflections when its surface was undisturbed, our minds can only perceive truth clearly when we stop creating mental agitation and allow natural awareness to emerge. This story reminds us that wisdom is not something we need to acquire from outside ourselves. It is our natural state when we stop disturbing our inner waters with constant mental activity. The practice of inner stillness reveals the clear seeing that has always been available to us. Story 4. The Woodcarver's Art. In a mountain village famous for its artisans, there lived a woodcarver whose sculptures were so lifelike that people said they seemed ready to walk away from their pedestals. Visitors would marvel at his ability to create such beauty from simple blocks of wood, and many aspiring artists begged him to teach them his techniques. One day, a talented but impatient young artist approached the master carver with great excitement. "Please, master, teach me your secret. I've been carving for years, but my work lacks the life and spirit that yours possesses. What special tools do you use? What is your method?" The old carver was working on a piece of cherry wood, carefully removing small shavings with his simple knife. He looked up at the eager young man and smiled. "I would be happy to share what I know, but first, Tell me, what do you see when you look at this piece of wood? The young artist examined the rough block carefully. I see a piece of cherry wood, about 2 feet long, with some interesting grain patterns. It has a few knots and some natural imperfections, but it's good quality material for carving. The master nodded and returned to his work, making precise cuts that seemed almost effortless. That is certainly an accurate description of what you're looking at, he said. But let me tell you what I see. He set down his knife and ran his hands lovingly over the wood surface. Inside this wood, there is a bird that has been waiting patiently to be freed. I can see its wings folded against its body, the tilt of its head, the curve of its beak. My job is not to create the bird, it already exists. My job is simply to remove everything that is not the bird. The young artist looked skeptical. But master, how can you see a bird that isn't there yet? Surely you're just imposing your own ideas onto the wood. The carver picked up his knife again and made a few careful cuts. Watch closely, he said. As he worked, the rough block began to reveal subtle curves and shapes that did indeed suggest the form of a bird. The bird was always here. I'm not creating it. I'm discovering it. But this requires great patience and deep listening. He continued. Most carvers try to force the wood to become what they want it to become. They fight against the wood's natural grain, cut away too much too quickly, and try to impose their will rather than work in partnership with the material. But true artistry comes from listening so carefully to the wood that you can sense what it wants to become. Over the following months, the young artist learned to approach his carving with this new understanding. Instead of rushing to shape the wood according to his preconceived ideas, he learned to sit quietly with each piece, studying its grain, feeling its texture, and waiting patiently until he could sense what form was waiting to emerge. To his amazement, his work began to transform. The sculptures he created now possessed a natural grace and authenticity that his earlier, more forced efforts had lacked. The lesson. The woodcarver's art teaches us about working with our authentic nature rather than against it. Just as the master carver could see the bird that already existed within the wood, we can learn to recognize and nurture the authentic self that exists within us, rather than trying to force ourselves to become something we're not. This story reminds us that true growth and creativity come from patient listening to our inner wisdom and allowing our natural gifts to emerge, rather than imposing external expectations or rushing the process of development. Like the carver who worked in partnership with the wood's grain, we can learn to work with our own natural tendencies and authentic nature to create a life of genuine beauty and meaning. Part 2. Wisdom in Relationships. Story 5. The Bridge Builder's Lesson. In a valley where 2 villages had been separated by a rushing river for generations, the people on each side had developed quite different ways of life. The villagers from the eastern side were known for their methodical, practical approach to problems, while those from the western side were famous for their creativity and artistic expression. Over time, misunderstandings had grown between the 2 communities, and they rarely interacted despite living so close to each other. One spring, after particularly heavy rains, the old rope bridge that had connected the villages was completely washed away. Both communities found themselves more isolated than ever, and tensions began to rise as trade became impossible and old friendships were severed by the uncrossable water. An elderly bridge builder heard about the situation and offered to help construct a new bridge. However, when he arrived and met with representatives from both villages, he quickly discovered that each side had very different ideas about what the new bridge should look like. The eastern villagers wanted a sturdy, utilitarian stone bridge that would last for centuries and require minimal maintenance. Practicality is what matters, their spokesman declared. We need something reliable and efficient. The western villagers envisioned an elegant wooden bridge with beautiful carvings and decorative elements. A bridge should inspire the soul, their representative argued. It should be a work of art that brings joy to all who cross it. The arguments between the two sides grew heated, with each group insisting that their approach was the only sensible one. After days of fruitless debate, both villages were ready to give up on the project entirely. The wise bridge builder listened patiently to all the arguments, then made an unexpected suggestion. Before we discuss materials or design, he said, let me ask you a simple question. What is the true purpose of a bridge? Both sides began to answer at once, but he held up his hand for silence. A bridge exists to connect what has been separated. Its greatest value is not in its materials or its beauty, but in its ability to bring people together safely. He continued, what if we built a bridge that honored both of your values? We could create a strong stone foundation and supports for durability and safety, but incorporate beautiful wooden railings and artistic details that bring joy to those who use it. The Eastern approach would ensure the bridge lasts, while the Western approach would ensure that people actually want to cross it. As the bridge builder guided both communities in working together on this shared vision, something remarkable happened. The Eastern villagers' practical skills were essential for the structural elements, while the Western villagers' artistic talents created details that made the bridge a true pleasure to cross. More importantly, as they worked side by side, the people from both villages began to appreciate and learn from each other's different approaches. When the bridge was completed, it was both sturdy and beautiful, a perfect integration of both communities' values. But the real success was that the process of building it together had bridged the gap of misunderstanding that had separated the villagers' hearts for so long. The lesson. The bridge builder's lesson teaches us that the strongest connections are built when we honor both our differences and our shared purposes. Rather than insisting that others adopt our way of seeing things, we can look for ways to integrate different perspectives and approaches in service of common goals. This story reminds us that conflicts often arise not because people have fundamentally different values, but because they have different ways of expressing the same underlying values. When we focus on our shared purposes and find creative ways to honor multiple approaches, we can build bridges that are stronger and more beautiful than anything we could create alone. Story 6. The Garden of Two Friends. In adjacent gardens separated only by a low stone wall, two longtime friends pursued their shared love of growing flowers. Though they had been neighbors for many years and both were passionate gardeners, their approaches to cultivation could not have been more different. The first friend, named Chen, believed in careful planning and control. His garden was meticulously organized with perfectly straight rows, precisely spaced plants, and a detailed watering and fertilizing schedule. Every bloom was exactly where he intended it to be, and not a single weed was allowed to survive. Visitors always admired the orderly perfection of his garden. The second friend, named Maya, preferred a more natural approach. Her garden appeared wild and spontaneous, with flowers growing wherever they seemed happiest. She allowed plants to seed themselves freely and welcomed volunteer flowers that sprouted unexpectedly. Her garden looked like a natural meadow that had been touched by magic. For years, the two friends had enjoyed comparing their different methods and sharing the produce and flowers from their respective gardens. However, as they grew older, Chen began to feel critical of Maya's chaotic approach, while Maya started to view Chen's methods as rigid and controlling. Their friendly discussions gradually became debates, then arguments. Chen would point to weeds in Maya's garden and suggest that her lack of discipline was preventing her flowers from reaching their full potential. Maya would counter that Chen's obsessive control was stifling the natural beauty and spontaneity that made gardens truly alive. One summer, a severe drought struck their region. Both gardeners watched anxiously as their beloved plants began to suffer from the lack of water. Chen increased his watering schedule and added shade cloth to protect his precisely arranged flowers. But many of his plants, accustomed to regular care, struggled to survive the harsh conditions. Maya's garden, which had always been more wild and independent, seemed to fare better initially. The plants that had learned to fend for themselves were more resilient. However, some of her more delicate flowers, which had never received focused attention, began to wilt without proper care. As the drought continued, both friends realized that their gardens were in serious trouble. One evening, as they stood by the wall separating their properties, Maya made an unexpected suggestion. "Chen," she said, "what if we combined our approaches? Your discipline and planning skills could help us use water more efficiently, while my knowledge of which plants are naturally drought-resistant could help us choose what to prioritize." Chen, swallowing his pride, agreed. They began working together, combining Chen's systematic watering schedule with Maya's intuitive understanding of plant resilience. Chen learned to appreciate the hardiness of Maya's self-seeded volunteers, while Maya gained new respect for the efficiency of Chen's organizational methods. By the end of the drought, both gardens had not only survived, but had become more beautiful than ever before. More importantly, the two friends had discovered that their different approaches were not competing philosophies, but complementary aspects of the same love for growing things. The lesson: the garden of two friends illustrates how differences in approach can become sources of strength rather than division when we move beyond judgment to collaboration. Like the two gardens that each had unique advantages and vulnerabilities, people with different styles and methods can learn from each other and create something more resilient and beautiful together than either could achieve alone. This story teaches us that instead of trying to prove our way is the only right way, we can remain curious about what others have to offer and open to the possibility that combining different approaches might lead to better outcomes for everyone involved. Part 4. Deeper Understanding. Story 7. The Student of Silence. At a renowned monastery known for its scholarly tradition and extensive library, a brilliant young student had spent 5 years mastering every text, memorizing countless sutras, and engaging in sophisticated philosophical debates with visiting scholars. He was widely regarded as one of the most intellectually gifted students the monastery had ever seen, and everyone expected him to become a great teacher. However, despite all his knowledge and academic achievements, the student felt increasingly frustrated and empty. The more he learned, the more questions seemed to arise, and the peace he sought through understanding seemed to slip further away. He could discuss the most complex spiritual concepts with eloquence, but he felt no closer to experiencing the truth these concepts were supposed to point toward. One day, he approached the monastery's eldest teacher, a simple monk who was known more for his presence than for his learning. Unlike the other teachers who were famous for their scholarly lectures, this old monk rarely spoke and was often found simply sitting in quiet meditation. "Master," the frustrated student said, "I have studied diligently for years and can recite thousands of teachings, yet I feel more confused than when I began. How is it that you, who rarely speak and seem to know so few texts, appear to have found the peace that eludes me?" The old monk looked at the young man with kind eyes and gestured for him to sit down. Instead of answering immediately, the teacher simply sat in comfortable silence. Minutes passed. The student, accustomed to constant discussion and analysis, began to feel uncomfortable with the lack of conversation. "Master," the student tried again, "I'm seeking guidance. Could you please share your wisdom with me?" The teacher smiled gently and continued sitting quietly. An hour passed in complete silence. The student's mind, usually busy with thoughts and questions, began to slow down despite his initial resistance to the lack of verbal instruction. As the afternoon wore on, something unexpected began to happen. In the deep silence shared between teacher and student, the young man started to experience a quality of peace and understanding that all his years of study had never provided. Without any words being spoken, he felt his restless mind beginning to settle into a natural stillness. When the sun began to set, the teacher finally spoke, his voice soft and gentle. "You have spent years filling your mind with words about truth. Today you have tasted truth itself." Which was more nourishing? The student realized that in those hours of silence, he had learned more about the nature of peace than in all his years of intellectual study. The endless stream of concepts and ideas he had thought would bring him closer to understanding had instead created more distance from the direct experience of what he was seeking. "But Master," the student asked, "are you saying that all my studies have been useless? Should I abandon learning altogether?" The teacher shook his head. "Your study has prepared you for this moment of understanding, just as clearing a field prepares it for planting. But now you know the difference between reading about water and drinking when you are thirsty. Use your knowledge as a map, but don't mistake the map for the territory it points toward." From that day forward, the student balanced his scholarly pursuits with regular periods of silent contemplation. He discovered that his intellectual understanding became much more meaningful when it was grounded in direct experience, while his meditation became richer when informed by wisdom gleaned from study. The lesson. The student of silence teaches us about the relationship between intellectual knowledge and direct experience. While learning and studying have their place in developing understanding, this story reminds us that true wisdom comes from direct experience rather than the accumulation of concepts. The student's transformation shows us that sometimes we need to empty our minds of what we think we know to experience what we're seeking. The story encourages us to balance our pursuit of knowledge with the cultivation of direct awareness, recognizing that both have value, but neither is complete without the other. Like the student who learned to use his studies as a map rather than mistaking them for the destination, we can appreciate intellectual understanding while remaining open to the more profound knowing that comes from direct experience.